was former British Prime Minister David Cameron who stated that the economy is the start and end of everything, which means that if, in order for us to have a strong economy, we need to have strong policies, strong reforms. But how disciplined are we as a nation to have those conversations, or to even implement those decisions? But those discussions are those topics and more. We have policy, well, not just policy, but the Executive Director of the Caribbean Policy Research Institute, Dr. Damien King. How are you, sir?
I'm fine, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I'm just going to run straight into one of the more lingering topics, I just want to understand the economics of it. The public sector compensation review. Now that we're on the tail end of it, what do you think of the decisions that were made, and how beneficial do you see those decisions from an economic standpoint?
Okay, let me take those two elements that you have raised in turn. First of all, just understand the arithmetic and the politics that brought it about. Civil servants generally get a small percentage wage increase every single year. You know, the wage agreements cover a number of years, and in most years it programs a modest increase. Those increases accumulate over time, as they should, because they largely try to compensate for inflation. It is always politically inconvenient for politicians to give themselves a raise of pay. So senior political leaders and those within the government, not the public administration, go for long periods of time without any increase. So when you want to look at the increase that has been proposed this year and that has been implemented this year, you can't see it in the context of just a one-year increase. You have to say, what percentage is that seen over the 2 decades, or whatever it is, since they got a last increase? And then compare that to what private sector workers and public sector workers have gotten over the same 20 years. So that's just the arithmetic fact of it. And then the percentage increase doesn't look so impressive. This is not making a judgment on whether it was too high or too low. I'm just saying you have to place it in its proper context. The second point about the economic implications. One of the problems that public administration faces, that we all appreciate, is that it is not able, for the most part, to attract the brightest minds, simply because it's too big a personal financial sacrifice. And on the occasions when we've been able to, in the public sector, attract people who are equally sought after in the private sector, it has been, few and rare. And you have to put that within the realization that the responsibilities and impact of decisions made in the public sector are far greater, far more consequential to our lives than the decisions that those persons are going to make in their private sector capacities. A brilliant manager who gets a job at a private company, at a Grace Kennedy or a Lasco or a JMMB, may do wonders for JMMB, but that only affects the shareholders of JMMB or whichever company it is. That manager making decisions in the public sector is going to affect the livelihoods of 3 million people. So you really want to be able to compensate and compete for the best and brightest.
How do we do that though? Because one of the statements that the Prime Minister had made is that, yes, we have done this increase in an effort to attract the brightest minds now. Do you think that that's actually one of the statement in and of itself is neither accurate nor inaccurate, but do you think that it will redound to something to that effect?
Do I think it makes a difference to someone who's considering public service,
Yes.
whether the annual pay is 6 million a year or 24 million a year,
Yes.
I think it makes a difference.
So it should be able to attract the brightest minds, though?
Well, it has the biggest responsibility and the most consequential results.
All right. So you pretty much were saying that they might still stand a chance then to attract the best, attract the brightest. And so when we look now, moving past the compensation review and how it affects us, because over the long run, it might not seem like too great an effect on us. But the current economic state now, we have been told that on the tail end of the pandemic, coronavirus, we are better off than we were going into, and we're growing. But in the same token, you find that the regular Joe is saying that I'm not seeing this growth, I'm not experiencing this. What do you say about that?
History does not give us the benefit of its counterfactuals. We don't get to see and experience what would have happened if a different path were taken. The relevant consideration and the relevant comparison is not our standard of living in 2023, today, to what it was in 2019, before the pandemic. The relevant comparison is our situation now to what it would have been if we had greeted the pandemic with the economic platform that we might have had two successive Jamaican governments not implemented the courageous fiscal management and economic reforms of the previous 5 years. Let me point to one particular metric, and there are many.
JDX.
Okay. The pandemic imposed the largest fiscal cost in Jamaica since independence, by far, about four times greater than the worst hurricane that has hit Jamaica in the last 60, 70 years. Had the government had to deal with that fiscal cost, the reduction in revenue, the additional expenditure, both for the distribution of cash to help out people and for the increased health expenditures, had they had to do that when the government's debt was 145% of GDP, which is close to what it had been back in 2012, 2010, 2008, 2007, had we not implemented those reforms beginning in 2012, coinciding with the IMF program, and then had to deal with the pandemic, the standard of living in this country now would be noticeably and significantly lower. We would have defaulted on debt, we would have been cut off from international financial markets, the government would not have been able to meet public service obligations, for public goods and street lights and security. And so people don't think they have benefited from the better fiscal management and the better economic management, but it is unmistakable that they have. Jamaica did not have the economic resilience and the fiscal capacity to handle the pandemic if the pandemic had come along in 2012 or 2014 or even 2016.
So it happened.
So Jamaicans are benefiting from that improved fiscal and economic management.
But when the man on the street says, I'm not experiencing this quote unquote better, what words of advice as an economist that you can share with him?
Yeah, just like how the man doesn't see the benefit of the car that might have hit him down had he been walking, a little slower. But that is an unfortunate fact of nobody ever seeing,
what could
history's counterfactuals.
Yeah. All right.
So, and let me answer that question more directly. Over the last 7 years, this economy has something like 110,000 more jobs than it had at the start of 7 years ago. That is like 10% of the labor force. So if you stop any of the people who had a job before and say, do you see any difference? They're going to say, no, I had a job, I still have a job. But if you ask any of the 110,000 who were unemployed before, if they have seen a difference, they have seen a big difference.
All right. Well, on that point, though, I remember glancing through something that CAPRI had published, and it seemed
always
to be,
a good thing to do.
It seemed to be, yes. It seemed to be hinting that we now have what you call historically low unemployment rates, and there's also a low GDP index, output index. What does this mean for economics, the policy formations and all of those things? Because here you have higher numbers of persons being employed, but still you have low GDP output.
That is an intriguing question, and one that was a paradox that we needed to dig into and try to understand. Over the course of the same last 7 years, when employment, the numbers employed, grew by 11%, total output, total production in the country, which we call GDP,
dropped to about 2.
Increased by only 2%.
All right.
And that's a huge gap. And what we discovered is that as employment expands, it will be drawing into employment, it will be drawing from the labor force persons who have fewer skills and capacities. And so therefore whose productivity is necessarily lower than the ones who were first employed. I mean, consider this, you have a business and you are hiring, you're going to interview 10 people, and if you have 2 positions, you're going to take the 2 best ones. So the others that are less capable remain unemployed. But as your business expands, some of those who you would not have hired before, now you have to call upon it. The people who run call centers tell me that, a few years ago, they had a minimum of 5 CXC subjects that you had to have in order to work in a call center. Now it only requires 2. So as the economy has to draw on those who have fewer skills, then you're not going to have the same impact on productivity and therefore the same impact on GDP.
All right, so we're going to go to our first break, but when we return, I want you to tell me whether or not this is what we can call diminishing returns to scale, but I'll hold you to that. You're watching The Conversation. I am sat with Dr. Damien King, Executive Director of Caribbean Policy Research Institute. This is The Conversation. We'll be right back. Welcome back to The Conversation. Dr. King, just before the break, I asked a question whether or not this is diminishing returns. Is that what we're seeing now? Because we say low unemployment index and same time low GDP output.
Yes, so the economy is experiencing diminishing returns, but there's a further implication to this, that the returns to hiring additional labor should not have diminished quite so low, except for the fact that since independence, we have done such a poor job of educating and skilling our labor force. So we should not have gotten to the point where diminishing returns set in quite as early as it did, and diminished to the point where those, who are now being hired, their productivity and their skill set is as low as it ended up being. But the root of that is having had an educational system that was not able to educate to a sufficient degree a sufficiently large portion of what has become the labor force.
So therefore I can argue that the education system has largely failed in terms of being able to provide quality vis-a-vis quantity.
Well, I mean, I don't want to use the word fail, because fail sets up a binary, you know, like there's a pass mark.
Well, a poor job.
So the point is that it ought to have done better in creating an educated labor force, and that is not due only to the educational system narrowly defined. It is due to all the other factors that determine why kids, you know, choose to stay in school or leave school at whatever point in time.
What would be some of those factors, though?
Well, you know, what are the, you know, what do kids see as the benefit of staying in school? What are the opportunities that they have around them in their own community? What are the role models that they see? So there are a lot of factors going on, but ultimately it is a result of the educational system and the surrounding factors that we have put in place. So we do have to take responsibility as a society, and the governments we have had have to take responsibility for it.
So in terms of our economic policy formulations now, how do we now formulate policies with this in mind, this reality in mind, so that we can, one, fix the issue now or correct the issue now, and then in the long term ensure that something like this doesn't happen again?
That's a brilliant question, because for much of our independence economic history, when we have had unemployment rates of 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15%, and even those who were employed, or many of them were employed part-time in insecure positions, so the employment situation was worse than that. So for much of this time, successive governments had an economic policy approach which was to create jobs. Indeed, up to the last general election, there was a competition between the two political parties in terms of the number of jobs they were going to create.
Just create jobs.
It was actually quite amusing, because it got to the point where both parties were actually claiming that they were going to create more jobs than we had unemployed people. So,
well, isn't that the case now?
And
more jobs than
the
unemployed
implementation of our macroeconomic policy framework reflected a desperation to get jobs. For example, a lot of the argument for special economic zones, where companies can set up and engage in economic activity by having a lower tax burden than somebody in the economy proper faces. So the government gets less revenue from that, and the linkages to the rest of the economy are less. So many of the benefits of being in a special economic zone and SEZ are less simply because it creates a job. The main purpose of an SEZ is to create a job. And when you have surplus unemployment, that seems like a good economic framework.
But now,
when we have the lowest unemployment rate, and I want to say something about the unemployment rate, but now that we have the highest level of employment in the country's history, and when you talk to people in the private sector, to a person they will tell you that they are struggling to get new workers. Then giving up fiscal revenue and giving up linkages to the rest of the economy just to create a job doesn't make sense. So that whole SEZ economic framework and the desperation to give concessions to get investment to create jobs does not exist anymore. There's no foundation for that anymore. So it really requires that governments create a new economic program that is not built around job creation per se as the primary objective.
So, but no, we're still having the issue where a number of persons are leaving Jamaica to find jobs abroad, and those unfortunately involved highly skilled persons who are leaving. So could it be then that locally, yes, there are a whole heap of jobs, but there are not a lot of high-paying jobs that are vacant, or high-paying positions that are vacant, so the brightest minds are still leaving?
Well, that comes back to the result of our educational system. We attract the jobs that matches the labor force that we have. We have a labor force that the Statistical Institute tells us is largely, overwhelmingly untrained and unskilled. More than 3/4 of the labor force have no skills or training, not even on-the-job training. So if you have somebody who has left high school in grade 9, has no particular skills, then don't expect a company to come to Jamaica that needs chemical engineers. If you have a low-skilled labor force, you cannot attract high-skilled jobs. So, you can't blame it on the kinds of jobs that we have. You have to come back to, do we have the labor force to meet any other kind of demand?
So I was just trying to pull up the tweet a while ago.
Oh no.
No, it's not about the shrimp. But what we want to find out though, we see where the finance minister had stated that he's going to give some relief to the bauxite levy, and that's in an effort to save jobs. But in light of what you have said, do you think that that's a wise decision for him to make?
Well, given the unemployment situation that we have now, that is not a spin that Statin has put on numbers. There is solid empirical data that we have record employment, and the vast majority of that increase in employment that I referred to over the last 5 to 7 years is full-time jobs in formal sector firms. A lot of it in call centers, a lot of it in construction. So in that context, in the context of full employment, effectively, in the context of businesses struggling to get additional workers, there's no basis for a government to give up tax revenue or any kind of revenue for the reason of saving jobs.
Let me contextualize it just in case no one is following this particular aspect. They said, so let me see if I have this clear. Businesses are allowed relief from taxes if they claim that not paying taxes will allow them to keep people employed. Didn't know about this part of the tax regime at all. How do the other 25,000 businesses in this country apply? So what do we get? What should we take from that?
One of my concerns with relief from the bauxite levy, and I must say that there are some technicalities around it that we're not getting into here. But the signaling is what is a concern. What is the signal that you send about compliance if the reason you give for allowing a relief from the bauxite levy is to save jobs? What is the signal you send to taxpayers, businesses and individuals, when you say, depending on your personal circumstances and your individual circumstances, maybe you don't have a tax obligation? So it's for that reason, it's a concerning development.
So I'm trying to find the silver lining and a ray of hope in all that you have been saying, because on one hand we're hearing about the bauxite levy, on the other hand you're saying that the labor force, there's an increased demand for workers than the labor force is able to supply, and then we're looking at quality. But then this is not just a function of wages. That's what you're saying. It's not just a function of wages, it's more a matter of skill. How can we know what other meaningful, tangible, short-term things that we can implement now, and then what other long-term things we can implement also?
Well, let's start with the long-term first. The long-term has to be through the educational system to make sure that as each cohort graduates, they are more skilled and more capable and have a better educational foundation. The reason why that's important is because the main purpose of a formal education is to create a platform on which upskilling and training can take place. It is not actually what you learn in fourth form that is beneficial, you know. It is not, well, boy, if I don't know how to factorize, then, you know, I'm going to get some job that requires me to do that. That provides a foundation under which you become adaptable and trainable and retrainable. So that is why it is of critical importance that we upgrade and have a more effective and a better educational system, you know, a formal educational system through elementary and high school, and to build out our tertiary education sector. So that's the long term. For the short term, upskilling programs are going to be important, and, you know, it's pleasing that the government has explicitly put a focus on that by appointing a minister who's going to have special responsibility for that. Also for the short term, though, that the country should consider allowing greater immigration to fill some of the needs. Now, this is not as big a leap as people make it out to be, and as your reaction just now suggests. As everybody knows, Jamaica suffers from brain drain. We educate and train and skill people who then take off.
Yes.
Okay? Something like 80% of the graduates of UWI ultimately migrate. So if we are able to have all of these people who we train and have them walk out once, you know, through one exit, why are we not willing to allow people to walk in through the entrance to replace them?
There are, I think there are a whole lot more implications that we have not yet considered.
And we make it extremely difficult to import labor. What you have to go through bureaucratically and financially at the Ministry of Labor to get a work permit is prohibitive.
All right, so with that, I think this is a good place on which to go to our break. We'll be right back in a few minutes. You're watching The Conversation. I'm Kwame Thomas. Welcome back to The Conversation with myself and Dr. Damien King, Executive Director of Caribbean Policy Research Institute. Just before the break, you started saying that one of the ways that we can perhaps fix this is to import labor. We already have brain drain. The best minds are leaving. What does it make sense? Because intuitively, I don't see where it would make sense for us to create an incentive for foreigners to come in, because that might cause a whole heap of other social problems. But what would be the best perspective?
Such as?
Well, first of all, I'm here for how long and I can't get this job.
But you can.
And this man just come in and get it.
You can. We have record high employment. That is how the situation is different. And let me say something else. The unemployment rate, as much as we have record high employment, the unemployment rate as it is measured is still 6%. But understand that in that 6%, that 6% does not necessarily represent productive capacity. No country has a zero unemployment rate, because there are perfectly good statistical reasons and structural reasons why you're always going to have a positive unemployment rate. In fact, economists speak about something called the natural rate of unemployment, which is like the lower limit to which the unemployment rate can go. And the perfectly good reasons are, first, many persons are as much as they would like to have a job, are not sufficiently productive in any dimension to be able to be hired. So it's not everybody who we see as, even though they would like to have a steady income,
can actually have one.
Can actually have one. Even more importantly though, there is a concept called frictional unemployment. And it's quite easy to understand. An economy is dynamic. You always have people who are leaving jobs for personal reasons, nothing to do with the business, nothing to do with the economy, because they are switching careers, or because they hate their boss, or because they are being harassed, and they leave and they go and look for another job, and you don't start a new one on the day after you leave the old one.
Yeah.
You know, you may decide you don't want to live in Kingston because it's too congested and too much crime, and you want to go live in Mandeville instead, or you want to go live in Montego Bay. And so it takes you a while to find a job. Also, and it's another way of looking at the same thing, companies, even within the same industry, some are contracting and some are expanding. So, on the day when McDonald's decided to close down its restaurants in Jamaica, all the McDonald's workers became unemployed. But at the same time,
Burger King,
Juicy and KFC were expanding. They don't get those new jobs the very next day. So every economy has that. It has dynamism. Industries are contracting while others expand. Businesses within an industry are contracting while others expand. And so you're always going to have, because of that friction, because information is not perfect, because people who graduate on May 15th
don't get a job.
Don't start a job on May 16th. You're always going to have some people who are measured as unemployed.
So my wheels are turning now, and I'm thinking that we might end up having what you have described in another one of your articles as growthless jobs, in that I'm here, I can't move up because I don't have the requisite skills, and I'm afraid to leave because of the same reason. Yes, I know I've asked how we can fix that in the long run, but getting somebody else from outside to come in now, who obviously is far more qualified than I am, socially, that might lead me to think that, listen, my bosses don't care about me anyway, because they're not giving me on-the-job training as much as they should or could, and all of those things.
Your bosses, if you left school in grade 9, your bosses cannot make you into a chemical engineer. More importantly, the business that depends on the chemical engineer cannot expand and hire the low-skilled person if it can't get the chemical engineer. Because a lot of these jobs are complementary. So you cannot hold up the expansion of the economy because you're afraid to bring in the particular skills that you need.
So, all right, so we have that issue of limited, what you call that, limited domestic capacity now for labor-intensive industries. So this obviously will put a limit on the impact of the government's goal in terms of increasing STEM graduates and pursuing STEM-driven industries in Jamaica, wouldn't you say?
Well, I mean, that has to be pursued anyway, but one certainly appreciates the value and the productive benefit of having technical skills that we refer to as STEM, science, technology, and so on. But we at the same time should not lose our appreciation for a broad general education that develops thinking skills. So it's not all about STEM. As much as we should make sure we have sufficient technical capacity in the labor force, nobody should get the impression that a degree in history or a degree in languages creates somebody who's not useful in the labor force. Okay, I would love to have a philosopher
Well, no, I mean,
A philosophy graduate working at CAPRI.
We technically call those heel jobs, and we don't hear much about those. But one of the things that I wanted to get, though, from you in terms of understanding was you had suggested, or your organization rather, had suggested a shifting of the incentives away from the labor-intensive industries. How might this impact the overall economic landscape and employment pursuits in Jamaica?
Yes, just to translate that, a shift in the economic strategy from trying to attract industries whose main benefit is job creation. That's what labor-intensive translates to, because we now have a labor constraint. So that economic strategy has run out of steam. So we can now have a broader economic strategy that has, longer term and wider benefits for the economy.
All right, so backtracking a little, the importance of increasing public sector efficiency is oftentimes emphasized. Could you provide any examples of specific inefficiencies within the public sector? You started to talk about one earlier, and how that could affect overall economic performance.
Examples of inefficiencies in the public sector. I mean, I have not spent any great deal of my own sort of research and contemplative time thinking about public sector efficiency. But anyone who has to deal with state agencies comes face to face with those inefficiencies. So I know that, and this is not a hypothetical example. I know if I start my work day and I have to make phone calls to 6 organizations, and 3 are private sector companies and 3 are state agencies, I know that the state agencies are not going to answer the phone. And that's what happens. So, and a lot of that has to do with, why is something as simple as answering a phone? Something that NCB can organize to do, and national land aid. I'm not picking on NLA because that was not one of the agencies.
Yeah.
But a national land agency, for example, or a Ministry of Labor can't organize to do. Well, it doesn't have to do with the particular person who's supposed to be manning the phone. That has to do with how management organizes the work in that agency. But that comes back to, why is it the managers are underpaid? If the managers are underpaid and you're not getting the best ones, then how do you expect the work to be organized in a way that it gets done efficiently?
So you're saying that this inefficiency is pegged, or should be pegged to positive expectations then?
It should be pegged to the kind of managers you can attract in the public sector.
All right, so we have not said it often enough, but the appointment of a minister with responsibility for skills and digital transformation, that has been highlighted as a positive step. Could you provide examples of any specific digital transformation initiatives that could be meaningful in terms of its impact?
Well, no, and I'll tell you, the minister that they've appointed is a highly competent person with a lot of experience in a transformational role in the private sector. So, I'm sure she'll be able to identify such programs. But we need to lower our expectations in thinking that somebody coming into a position where, as we said, 3/4 of the labor force are unskilled by the lowest measure. Digital transformation and upskilling is not something that is going to be quantitatively impactful on a scale where it is going to, in the context of the whole economy, be transformational.
So we're looking at how long
there's just so much you can do when you're starting with a low base.
So this person is starting with their hands tied behind them.
No.
Okay.
It's not that their hands are tied. Even with their hands completely free, it is only at best going to have marginal impact over the entire labor force.
But admittedly, though, that is definitely a step in the right direction.
Oh, absolutely.
So we look at the.
It's a step in the right direction because it recognizes now that is the constraint. That is one of the binding constraints on economic growth, and it represents something that is even. It is symbolic of a positive shift that has taken place in economic policy over the last 10 years. Up until 10 years ago, the Jamaican economy represented a poor environment in which to invest and do business. The infrastructure was inadequate. The rules were ever changing. The government was so highly indebted that the risk of fiscal default was a constant fear. The exchange rate was depreciating fast. Inflation was high. And with all of that going on, if you have some capital to put down, you're not going to risk it in an investment in which the payoff is 10 years, much less 20, which is where the best investments are. Mm-hmm. You're going to put it in something where you can turn it around in a year or two because you don't know what's going to happen after that. So that is, the poorness and weakness of the economic and business environment was what we had put together in 50 years of independence. Starting 10 years ago, and what you got in that is a desperation for investment. So an investor might come in and say, boy, I'm thinking of putting in a plant. And then everybody in government jumps up and says, okay, let's find land for them and let's give them tax breaks and let's do anything in our desperation to get this investment. And the investment is not going to last because it's in an environment that is not, is not facilitating doing business in the long term. Much of what we have done in the last 10 years improves the economic environment overall. We've made a commitment to low single-digit inflation. And that commitment has been tested, and the Bank of Jamaica has passed the test.
So do you think then that we've
made a commitment to a balanced budget?
We're desperate enough. That's what you say.
We've made a commitment to a it didn't come out because of desperation.
No, what I'm trying to pull out in is that whether or not you think that we're desperate enough to make the requisite changes so that we can.
We have made the requisite changes. That is what I'm going through. Mm-hmm. Okay. Jamaica ran fiscal deficits in all but 10 years in the 50 years since independence. We've had a balanced budget all of the last 10 years within the margin of error.
All right, so let me hold you on that one. We'll be back after this break. This is a conversation. Welcome back to the conversation. So, Dr. King, just before the break, you were saying that for the past, pretty much we've been meandering in the wilderness for the better half of 5 decades. And now you're saying that I'm saying that we have gotten to that place where we're desperate enough to make the requisite change.
No, it's not a significant change has taken place between our approach to economic development in the first half century of independence and what has happened for the last 10 years. It's not out of desperation.
Okay.
The country's been desperate for a long time.
Oh.
Okay. Desperation is never a sufficient motivation for significant change.
So you think we're motivated enough to make those changes?
Jamaica was one of the most indebted countries in the world for nearly 10 years. And during that period, between 2000 and 2012, we continually elected governments, we elected parties that promised to make the economic problem worse, that promised to spend more, usually, and got elected on that basis. So desperation wasn't enough. But what has happened is, as I started to say before the break, before 10 years ago, we saw economic policies that were literally piecemeal, in the sense that we built our hopes around a particular large investment or a government initiative. And economic growth in any economy, even a small economy, is not going to come about because of any particular initiative or any number of initiatives that you can count. For an economy to become more productive, you need to influence the decision making of 3 million people and 200,000 businesses. So it has to be approached by what improves the economic platform and the conditions for business activity.
In other words, we need to create the environment that can allow growth.
Yes, just like a garden. Okay, if you have a garden where the soil is not good and the irrigation is not good, sticking 2 or 3 more plants in the ground is not going to help you. You need to improve the conditions. And that is what Jamaica has actually been doing over the last 10 years. One, by bringing down the debt, and bringing down the debt from 145% of GDP down to below 80% of GDP now.
Yeah, about 76 or 74.
Has created, a situation now where up to half of tax revenue was going to service debt, And that is why the governments were not able to provide public services. That has improved. And people's minds are now thinking, is the government going to default next year? Or is the government going to print their way out of debt? People don't have to worry about that. And then they can, and now they can expect that inflation is going to be more tempered. Now we are investing in infrastructure. Okay? We went for many decades after independence without investing in infrastructure. Look how long we put up with Flatbridge. So and behind a truck if you wanted to go over Mount Russell to get to the North Coast. And now we are seeing the infrastructural development. All of these things are important.
But aren't we seeing with these infrastructure developments, aren't we seeing a lot of extractions, where a lot of leakages, where a lot of the monies are going back to these countries, because we have used loans to finance these. So aren't we racking up more loans, more debts?
Loans are never the problem, If you are taking a loan from your parents or from a bank to go to Dream Weekend, then you have a problem. If you are taking a loan from your parents or a bank to buy a pickup truck to deliver your produce from your farm, then you are investing to get a return that is greater than the cost of the loan.
All right. So with that said, then are we saying that Jamaica is, or is it becoming the place to work, raise families, and do business?
Well, we have a ways to go.
But not quite there yet.
I am saying that the economic reforms that have taken place over the last 10 years, not due to the IMF. It was within the context of IMF programs, but not due to the IMF, because we had IMF programs before that. And we had neither the commitment nor the discipline to implement the economic reform. And since the IMF program has ended, we have continued to stick to our commitments. So credit the last 2 Jamaican governments and not the IMF. I'm saying those economic reforms have been put in place. There are still issues and constraints that we need to overcome. The labor force is a constraint. Crime is a constraint. Further investments in infrastructure, such as having reliable freshwater supply in the big cities, in particular Kingston, so they have water lockoffs. You can't grow an economy if workers have to leave their workplaces at 2 o'clock to run home and catch water. So constraints and problems are always going to be there. But there has been a meaningful economic reform over the last 10 years. the most recent of which is the attention that is being paid to resilience.
Yeah.
Both in terms of, now that we have fiscal room, now that we have catastrophe insurance, now that we have a contingency fund, so that every storm that comes along, even a category 1 hurricane, and it destroys the roads and knocks down some of the facilities, doesn't throw out the fiscal budget.
Okay, so you're saying that we're better prepared now to step in the right direction.
We're better prepared, and us having survived quite fine, thank you, the economic and fiscal blow of the pandemic is proof of that.
All right, so you had made a proposal some time ago that we could tie the income tax threshold to the consumer price index. How would this strategic move, shield taxpayers' earnings from the erosive effects of inflation within our local context?
Let me put that in a larger context. One of the areas that I think in terms of economic and social policy that we have been wholly inadequate is in terms of our social safety net, which is the term that means how do we look after those who are economically least well off. Now, some people are sort of in that state permanently. Those may be the people who we referred to earlier as the permanently unemployed.
Yeah.
Because for whatever circumstances, they lack the discipline and the skills to be a part of the labor, to be a part of the productive labor force. Others may suffer temporary setbacks because their particular industry, goes through a problem and they get laid off, or because of health issues. So the social safety net is the society's mechanisms for looking after those people. What we have is inadequate. And making that discussion slightly larger still, we end up with insufficient economic mobility and social mobility. So, with few exceptions, those in our society who are least well off economically are the great-grandchildren of the same ones who are least well off economically 100 years ago.
Wow.
We don't create those opportunities. And it's not because, just biologically all the smart people are born in Norbrook. No, it's because the opportunities are not presented to them. So one of the critical areas that Jamaica faces going forward is to create and enhance both the social safety net and means of social and economic opportunity so that we have more social mobility. So and the elementary school system is a critical part of that.
But tying those two together, though, many of your critics admittedly would contend that hiking personal income tax threshold.
I don't understand. My critics?
Critics? I don't. You don't have critics?
I don't have any.
Wow. All right, we'll follow up with that on Twitter in a couple. But they might contend that hiking the personal income tax threshold might drain government revenues, potentially endangering crucial services, the services that you just spoke about.
The income tax threshold refers to the amount of income that you earn in a year for which you owe no income taxes. It was set at $1.5 million a year,
yes,
7 years ago, when the present administration came in. That was their big election promise. It serves a useful purpose as part of what we are talking about in this, economic redistribution that the government has to take primary responsibility for effecting, so that those who are least well off are not quite as badly off as they would have been if the government didn't take on this role. We don't want people whose incomes that are too low paying income taxes. What we have had, though, is that it was set at 1.5 million in purchasing power 7 years ago. But as inflation has accumulated over the last 7 years,
that has eroded.
Then the purchasing power of that same 1.5 million is now a third less than it was 7 years ago. So if we thought it was a good idea 7 years ago that people with $1.5 million worth of purchasing power shouldn't pay income taxes, then why now do we think that it is only 1 million? So we need to restore that. And to prevent it from continually eroding, we need to set that threshold. And I think something like 2.1 million now would restore it. But we need to attach that threshold to our measure of inflation so it adjusts automatically every year.
Okay. All right. But now that we're striving,
and just to say that's a recommendation coming out of CAPRI's most recently published report, which is Budget Breakdown 2023, which you can get on our website at capricaribbean.org.
Okay, good. So as a country now, we are making strides in terms of debt reduction, as you have said, revenue increase. What roadblocks or hurdles could obstruct this kind of a recommendation, and how do you foresee steering through these obstacles effectively to get that change, those changes?
Well, I mean, one of the major roadblocks is how you introduce the question, which is loss of tax revenue. Most lay people, understandably, think of taxes as something they would rather not have. But economists look at taxes in a different way. If you were to ask me to pick a country to live in based on one single criterion, if I could look at just one statistic to decide which country to live in, I would ask for the share of taxes, share of GDP that is collected in taxes, and all the countries where it is low I would avoid. Because the most important institution for economic and social stability is the government. Countries in which the institutions of government are so weak that they are unable to collect taxes are generally the ones where public order does not exist and public services are weak, and they are really hard places to live. I mean, I don't know the exact number, but I'm sure the tax to GDP ratio in Haiti is very low. It probably is single digits. So it's a measure of both the competence of government and that government is fulfilling its public obligations when there's a reasonably high tax to GDP ratio.
All right. So in 30 seconds,
yep.
Tell me, where do you see us going in the next 3 years to a decade?
I like that question as a closing question, because given what I've described about Jamaica's approach to economic development in the 50 years after independence, that it was chaotic and ineffective and wrongly focused, then, as an economist, Jamaica was a frustrating place to live and work in. But based on the steps that we've made over the last 10 years, that we have reason to be more optimistic about the economic future of Jamaica right now, than we have been since independence. So as much as there are constraints and hurdles that remain, I've pointed out a few of them, even with that, we're in a better position to try to address those than we would have been otherwise. So from an economic point of view, I am cautiously optimistic about the future of Jamaica.
Cautiously optimistic. All right.
And the focus is on the optimistic.
Optimistic. Cautiously optimistic, but more on the optimistic side than cautious. All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Damien King. There you have it, our discussion with Dr. Damien King, Executive Director of the Caribbean Policy Research Institute. So we hope that you will join us next time for another edition of The Conversation. I'm Kwame Thomas. Have a good one.